One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brülosophy Podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Welcome, listeners, to the 200th episode of the Brülosophy Podcast. I am your host, Marshall Schott, and it feels absolutely insane to me to be saying 200. When we decided to start this podcast back in early 2017, I remember thinking how nuts it would feel to hit 100 episodes, and it did when we got there a couple years ago. It was just a few months after that episode that COVID hit, and we had to make some pretty tough decisions, some that admittedly left me wondering if we'd even be able to weather the storm. The fact that we're here today is obviously evidence that we have been able to weather that storm. And I just have to say that we have all of you wonderful listeners to thank for that. Joining me on this episode to answer listener submitted questions is co-host of the Brü Lab and Brülosophy contributor, Cade Jobe.
Yeah, so man, 200 episodes. I just, it doesn't seem like it's been that many. It's flown by so fast, but at the same time, it feels like it's been 200 episodes too. But I mean, just incredible, right? I mean, you started this just a couple of years ago and started the podcast before even I came on. But man, dude, to do 200 and to have, who knows, plenty more where that came from is just super cool. And thanks to everybody who listens to this show and keeps us running. Yeah,
I'm sure every podcaster out there feels the same way, but our listeners truly are some of the coolest, man. I can't express just how much we've appreciated all of your support over the last few years. It really is what has kept us going, and I look forward to answering a bunch of your questions today on this Brü A episode. If you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our next session is coming up in just a few short days, Saturday, August 28th, 2021, and the guest is Enno Beer brewer and advocate Alex Liberati of Denver, Colorado. Alex has been featured in publications like Forbes magazine and has a passion for this deliciously unique style. In order to be a part of this event, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brülosophy by this Friday, August 27th, 2021 at the latest. Otherwise, we won't have time to get you added to the private Facebook group where these sessions are hosted and where all past sessions are stored. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review about this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to leave reviews, we really would appreciate it. Thanks to the nearly 900 people who've already left a review. We are so excited to cross that 1,000 mark, so please help us get there. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover-compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brülosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Listener Mitch Carlin wrote in with some feedback on our recent episode where we talked about souring in an open vessel. He says, I'm not a huge sour brewer myself. I'm not even really a sour drinker, but my partner doesn't mind a sour, so I do occasionally find myself lumped with the task of providing a sour to keep her hydrated. When I first started researching how the whole kettle souring process works and what methods were needed, I wasn't overly convinced I wanted to leave my kettle on for a day or two unattended to let the souring happen, nor did I feel like battling with cling film. So being an Australian homebrewer, I looked toward my trusty hot cube. On brew day, after the usual mash and short boil, I transfer the wort to a 25-liter cube, sit it in my fermentation chamber, monitor the temp until it was about 35C, which is 95F, pitch 5 or 6 probiotics, flood the cube headspace with CO2, and screw the lid on. The souring process takes about 36 hours to get the pH where it needs to be, which seems in line with other methods. As the cube cools, souring does slow down, so I put a hot water bottle in the fermentation chamber every 5 hours or so, though you could also use a heat pad or a heat belt to keep it consistent. With the pH where you want it, it's back into the kettle for the usual process from there. I guess it's not quite open or closed souring, cube souring maybe. This probably isn't the newest idea in the book, but I thought it might be helpful to someone else.
Yeah, for sure. I've also wondered about that too, right? Like, especially with electric brewing, if you're just sort of leaving the recirculation on and that hot liquid is sort of going around. But I've never had any trouble with it. My thing is I just don't want to have to clean the cube, right? Like, yeah. I'd rather just leave everything in the kettle. That way it just does this thing in the kettle. Then I can just heat the wort up straight as soon as I get to the pH that I'm looking at. And I've had pretty good success. Usually it's less than 24 hours for me, not a full 36. And I just wonder, I don't know. I mean, 95 Fahrenheit is where is great souring temperature, but I'm usually right at 100 or 104 or so. And maybe that's why I'm getting a little bit more sour a little bit quicker, is it's just a little bit warmer. But I mean, I love the idea. Certainly no reason why you can't if you don't want to leave. If you've got propane or something, then yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to leave a propane burner on for a full day.
I agree. The few times that I've done kettle souring, I don't have the time to do that often because we're brewing other things for Brülosophy that we need to kind of pump out a little bit quicker. But the few times that I've done it, I've used just uncrushed grain. And I really like the complexity that I've gotten out of that. I've been lucky enough to not have it go south on me. And I do use the SS Brewtech 1V systems, and I just set it to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about, I think, 38 or 39 C. And it takes about 36 hours using that method, right? The uncrushed grain method, for me to get the tartness that I want out of it, that level of acidity that I prefer. I could see if you're pitching, a probiotic or something, it maybe not taking as long. I don't know, but I definitely relate with the concern, Mitch, of leaving that element on. We leave other electronics on all the time anyways, and it seems not to have a big issue. So I don't know if it's a big problem, but I've heard from people who do worry about that as well. So this is a great alternative for those who just don't want to leave their element on if they're using an electric system. So thank you for the feedback, Mitch. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Well, as most of you are likely well aware at this point, our friend and beer reviewer extraordinaire, Jersey, recently moved to a new state from California, which means the 1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim, as we know it, is coming to an end. In fact, I found it fitting that their last review happens to coincide with this, our 200th episode, which is sort of a milestone for us. For this final review, the boys sampled a golden stout submitted by listener Zach Otting from Union, Kentucky, that was made with home toasted oats, and while it's not listed in his notes, I have to imagine he hit it with a dose of coffee as well.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. Here's just a bar boy from a bar family.
It looks clear and I can't smell anything. Let me see.
You should let him see.
Dear God.
Spare Timmy, please, from this monstrosity.
That has an aroma right there.
Easy come, easy go. It does not feel good in his nose.
It smells like a big pepper.
A big pepper. How big, Tim? Now, you are
On a
so
scale.
learned. No, you're so learned that you can smell this beer and say that this is a large pepper. Are we talking like 20 pounds or like the size of Manhattan? How big of a pepper does that smell like?
That is just not nice, you piece of
I love you.
It's just a pepper.
You're a pepper.
Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too?
Okay, we're devolving into madness. For those of you that think we do these every week, no. We do them in bunches, and this is one of the ones where we're already shafast.
It tastes just like it smells.
Are you shafast?
And it's not good.
You're shafast, aren't you?
It's
It's not good?
not for me.
Well, Timmy, I trust you with my life, my fortunes, and my beer reviews. If you don't think it's good, I don't even need to drink it, dude. We've never several times we've disagreed.
It's some sort of pepperish kind of.
Some sort of pepper.
And it doesn't taste good for me.
Here we go. Now Jers is weighing in. I smelled the pepper. But I like the taste. It's smooth and
It's smooth.
light.
I'll give
It's smooth
that.
and light. It's smooth and light.
But it tastes just like it smells. And
What taste are you not liking? Because there isn't a lot of taste. Just like you, it has minimal taste.
I don't like it.
Shall we declare nuclear Jersey, Tims?
If I don't like it, I don't like it.
Well, how can you not like it? There's no flavor. This is delicious. This is good to me. How do you not like this?
I just don't like it.
Why?
I told you.
You can't just say I don't like it. Give a reason. Give me one reason you don't like this beer, or I'll stop doing beer reviews.
It's just not good.
We'll hang our hats on that one, gents. Okay, drink one more time.
I don't like the peppery taste.
There's no...
To me, it does.
A little bit of peppery taste. I'll give you that. But it is a good... It's an all right beer. I like this beer.
Well, good.
9,654.3 jerseys. What do you give it?
I give it a 2.
Okay, that averages to something like 4. 4 jersey Tims.
I'm not confident enough to guess the size of the pepper, but I have to agree with Tim that there was a rather strong pepper note in the aroma. Still, I thought the flavor was actually quite pleasant. I'm not really a fan of Golden Stout as a style, but as far as they go, Zach's was a solid example in my opinion.
Yeah, that pepper pith. I always get that a lot when in stouts, or I guess I'm getting it increasingly in stouts. And I wish I could remember. There was a guy that I judged with the NHC a couple of years back, and he had an explanation for it. I can't remember what it was, but it had something to do with the roasted grains and the way that you add those into the mash, or at least some theory. But yeah, that pepper flavor, it always bothers me. And anytime I taste it, it becomes the only thing I can taste.
Yeah.
But still, I like a good golden stout. I like stouts in general, and I mean, it sounds like a good beer, and I don't have anything wrong with the style. But man, I'm going to be so sad to see Jersey go. Going to miss that guy.
I know, me too, man. I already miss the guy. He's already left. He is coming back into town occasionally to finish up some work stuff that he's got going here, and we've got plans to do kind of a final episode, kind of one of our quote unquote live episodes with him. Now, just a note on what we're planning to do now that Jersey is gone. Out of the 2,550 people who completed the single question survey we put out a couple weeks back, a whopping 57% felt that we should continue the 1 minute beer review with another friend replacing Jersey. At this point, that is the plan. We've just got to nail a few things down first. I do currently have just a grip of listener submitted beers in my fridge. So once this friend of ours agrees to it, we're going to schedule a review session, and perhaps I'll record an updated jingle. Thanks to everyone who took that survey, and especially to all of those who submitted beers over the last few years for Jersey and Tim to review. This little idea of mine became something that I really value, and we're all going to miss Jersey, but we're excited to see where things go from here. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage that you have made yourself or that you pick up somewhere else featured on the show, you can email me, marshall@brülosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, answers to your questions. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brülosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BRUPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. It seems the questions never stop flowing in. If we don't happen to get to one that you asked today, we do apologize. It will likely be featured in a future Brü A episode. All right, first question comes from Haven Schultz, who says, I currently ferment under pressure using a Firmzilla. I connect the gas post of the Firmzilla to the liquid post of my keg. I connect a spunding valve to the gas side of the keg to keep the entire linked system at a certain pressure. I sanitize my keg prior to closing it off and don't push sanitizer out of it, mainly because I don't have enough spare kegs on hand. When fermentation is complete, I then hook gas to the gas line and liquid to liquid lineup to both the keg and fermenter. I decrease the pressure in the keg, and that starts my closed transfer. Do you think it would be an issue to add dissolved gelatin into the keg prior to sealing it up for capturing CO2? I don't cold crash when pressure fermenting until it chills in the kegerator, so there's no suck back. And even when the closed transfer is going, the liquid post is being used as an inlet rather than an outlet. So theoretically, the gelatin wouldn't leave the keg at all and would mix with the beer. All of this is done at ambient temp, 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees C, and once transferred, goes into my kegerator. Do you see any issues with the gelatin mixture sitting in the keg for a week or so as the beer ferments? I can't think of any, and my research hasn't presented any, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on one way or another.
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts on this one, but one of the things I would like to see is I would love for you to just try this and see if it works and let us know, right? I've got a couple thoughts on it, and I did a little bit of research myself on it. You know, this is personal experience for me. That gelatin mixture usually firms up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I mean, like within a few minutes for me. And so that mixture is it makes sense to me that mixture would gelatinize or would become solid well before you transferred the beer. The other thing I don't know is how gelatin reacts with CO2, like in just a CO2 gas solution, right? Like, is it going to firm up, or is it going to stay, is it going to get into those like hard particles, dehydrated particles, or is it going to just form a big clump of gelatin stuck on the bottom of your keg? So I really don't know exactly what that's going to do. And the other problem, the only thing I can think of, one of the other problems I can think of is that you're going to you need the beer cold in order for haze causing particles to form. Right. And so if you're putting the gelatin in while it's at ambient temperature and then crashing, the gelatin's going to have mixed into the beer and then fall out of the beer before you get down to that appropriate temperature. So those are just a couple of my thoughts. But again, it's not like I can say, yeah, don't do it, or yes, do it.
Yeah, you share the same thoughts I do, or I share my thoughts with you, Cade. It makes sense to me. We know that gelatin is going to gelatinize. It's gonna form that harder clump, at least faster in cooler environments, and that's why I think traditionally when we're fining with gelatin, you add it to cold beer because you want that cold beer to kind of shock that gelatin into attracting the particulate and then gelatinizing out and falling out of solution. So it makes sense to me that by adding it, I guess, during fermentation, it sounds like is what Haven is asking here, that maybe the natural agitation of fermentation would keep that gelatin from gelatinizing, and then when you chill it, it would do the clarifying. The issue is, and Cade, I'm surprised you didn't bring this up because it was an experiment that you performed. We've actually done an experiment comparing adding gelatin at yeast pitch to one added more traditionally at cold crash. And the if you just go look at the pictures, the experiment was not significant. So people couldn't taste the difference. That's tended to be the case with most of our gelatin experiments. But in looking at the photos of those beers, the beer where the gelatin was added at yeast pitch is just hazier than the one where the gelatin was added at cold crash, which goes to kind of suggest, it indicates that maybe the same process isn't occurring with that gelatin fining if it's not added once the beer is cold. So I'm just not sure. I guess my response is more, Haven, I don't know if you'd get the expected or intended reaction that you're looking for. That you're not going to get the clarifying that you would get if you just added it when the beer is cold.
Yeah, and that's a good, and another good point too is the way that gelatin works, right? So again, you brought up that it attracts those differently charged particles, and I can't remember if it's positive or negative. That's available on the internet if you look it up. But it all it does is fall through the solution, right? And everything clumps to it, and then those clumps get so heavy that they fall out of solution. And so again, I think that was sort of what we talked about in that experiment, with the gelatin at yeast pitch versus gelatin at cold crash, is that if it's during yeast pitch, the gelatin's already going to have settled out and clumped up before you get to the point where you need to pull out all of that residual yeast or, polyphenols, hot phenol complexes and all that stuff that causes haze. So yeah, I mean, those things, if you're really worried about it and you really don't have a good way, I think it's either Andy or it may be Phil. Or maybe it's Jake. One of them uses a syringe to inject gelatin. I think I just went through like half of the contributors.
Yeah, that's Andy. He actually recently posted a photo of that. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe reach out to Andy and see if you can pick his brain about how he came up with that syringe idea. And then you can just inject it into the blow off post while it's sitting in your refrigerator.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
All right. Well, let's go to the next question. So Tony wrote in on the podcast, you mentioned overbuilding starters and storing them in the fridge until needed. I also do this, and I'm wondering if each time I pull it out and pitch it into another starter, does it A, need to be at 1.037 specific gravity, or does a lower gravity vitality starter suffice when doing so within 6 months of the initial storage date? And B, does it need to be counted against the generational count, since this should be, in theory, a clean sample? I typically use the Brü United calculator and overbuild by 100 billion cells.
All right, Tony. So you think about these things far deeper than I do. I'm gonna go ahead and put it that way. When I started harvesting yeast from starters, everything was presumption. I've always admitted that. I've never done cell counts. I did send in some yeast starter that I'd harvested, little harvested slugs, to a friend of mine way in a different state, in fact, but who did run a cell count for me, and it was right around where I wanted it to be. I think it was actually closer to like 125 to 130 billion cells. So that made me happy enough. I'm not afraid of over pitching. And so that's one thing. I've also done some experimentation with, this was long ago, and I did not do official experiments where I was comparing beers side by side. But what I wanted to build up a yeast for pitching into a higher OG beer. And I thought, well, if I'm going to pitch into a higher OG beer, what if I made a starter that was higher OG? And according to the calculator, which I too used the Brü United calculator back then, according to the calculator, the higher the SG of that starter were, the more yeast replication I was going to get. And those beers came out just fine. I wasn't having any issues. So to answer A, from my opinion, I'm only sharing opinion here. Does it need to be at 1037 SG? I don't think so. And in fact, I think a lower gravity, you might not get as much, cell division. I'm not a microbiologist, but I think you'll be fine. It's going to be less stressful on that yeast. So if anything, in my head, you're going to have the lower risk of producing off flavors or stress related, byproducts that you don't want in your beer. Does it need to be counted against the generational count, since this should be in theory a clean sample? I don't think so. That's something I've never even considered when I'm building these things up. I always presume if I'm using the yeast within about 90 days of harvesting it, that I just put, what I presume that the cell count in it is, which is about 100 billion cells. So.
Yeah. On that last point, the generational count, I think that you do need to count it. And the reason is because you are making a new generation of cells, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so you're growing up. I mean, you've got whatever you overbuilt. So you're overbuilding, Tony, by 100 billion cells. So let's say you actually have 100 billion cells that you then pitch into a starter. That starter then grows up to what, 300 or so, depending on what you're pitching into your wort. So yeah, you've replicated those 100 billion cells. So you've created a new generation of cells. So yeah, I think that absolutely should count in your generation count. The first question about whether it needs to be at 1037, I like Marshall's answer on this. And I guess, I think my point, I think I mostly agree with Marshall. I would just make a comment that the 1.037 SG isn't necessarily a set in stone number, right? I mean, somebody did, I assume somebody did some trials out there and said, hey, if I have a gravity that's at this point, I get enough cells, right? I have enough sugar in solution that the cells can grow up to the point that I want. Adding more than that seems to be just dumping, extra sugar in there and maybe not having the benefit of growing enough cells. But at the same time, like Marshall said, underdoing that gravity might not have the effect on growing as many cells as you want. And if you don't have a way to do cell counts, you never really know.
Right.
So my comment would just be, hey, 1.037 seems to work. And so I would just do it at that, even if you're within 6 months. And yes, count it in the generation count. So every time you take that sample out of the refrigerator and then grow up another starter is a new generation.
Okay. Yeah. I kind of misread that. I agree with you completely on that, Cade. Yeah, it's new generation, and count that. Also, I 1037, that's an interesting number. I always went for 1040 to 1045. That was just kind of my aim. So, but again, and it works. And it's so easy for us in this hobby to get into the weeds a bit because we really like numbers, and a lot of us tend to geek out a bit. But there's a lot of flexibility here. There's a lot of leeway when it comes to this stuff. So, all right, next question comes from, I hope I say this right, Hewell Lacrasse from the United Kingdom, who says, whenever I've made lagers or pale ales, they've turned out perfect for the duration of me drinking the keg. But the more hoppy styles like New England IPA, I've found that within a couple of weeks, the hop flavor has almost disappeared, leaving a bland beer. I brew in a Brew Tools B80 machine, and I ferment in either stainless steel bucket fermenters or a stainless steel conical, neither of which can be used for pressure fermenting or pressure transfers. I do open the fermenter lids after about 4 days to dry hop, but this is before active fermentation is finished. After fermentation has finished, I cold crash with a balloon filled with CO2 to reduce oxidation. We call those balloon locks. I've always performed closed transfers with the fermenter up high on a table and the corny keg below, with the fermenter valve connected to the liquid in on the keg, while the gas out on the keg is connected to the airlock hole at the top of the fermenter. I believe they refer to this as a closed loop transfer. I purge the keg with CO2 before filling, but I don't push sanitizer out with CO2 as some recommend. Am I doing anything wrong? Why does my initially hoppy and very flavorful beer taste very bland within 2 weeks? Is this oxidation? There is no color change in the beer that I've heard is associated with oxidation. Are there any further steps I could do to minimize cold side oxidation? I have a 4-tap kegerator and switch up the beers I drink each night, so they usually last a few weeks, but unless I drink just the NEIPA as soon as it's made, it starts to taste very bland. Would a fermenter that allows for pressure fermentation and pressure transfer improve the flavor retention? Would canning instead of kegging a freshly made NEIPA help the flavor retention?
Man, so this is a tough one, Hewell, and because it sounds like you're doing so much right.
Yeah.
In terms of cold side oxidation. I mean, I love that you're using the balloon lock. You're the adding hops at dry hop. I don't think is going to cause any issues, especially if it's still active fermentation. And we've done an experiment or two on that doesn't seem like that's going to cause any issues. I have a couple of, I guess, things to look at. I'm not sure that they're going to be that helpful, and then I'll answer some of your questions. But one of the things you may look at is to see if there are any leaks elsewhere in your system. Like if you've got a leak in a connection to your line, or if you've got a leak in the keg. Sometimes you can get like reverse pressure in the keg, especially if you're using a closed loop transfer. None of those things really seem like that's going to be it. And if you're not noticing color change, I'm not sure if it's oxidation, but it has to be oxidation.
It sure sounds like it, huh? Yeah.
Right? It sure sounds like it. Everything else sounds like it. So here's a suggestion. Try using metabisulfite and see if that causes a stability. So if you've got a Camden tablet, just crush it up and drop it in the keg before you purge it. Otherwise, 0.3 grams of potassium metabisulfite or sodium metabisulfite, and see if that helps. If that, that is a preservative and an antioxidant. So it should, if oxidation is the issue, preserve preserve the flavor of the beer. If it's not oxidation, not sure.
There are 3 telltale signs for me and this is almost all with hoppier IPA, namely New England IPA, hazy IPA, of cold side oxidation. One is a change of color, which Huell says he's not experiencing. The other is a change of flavor to the extent that the malt character develops this kind of nasty, sickly, sweet thing. I've described it as the center of a lemon drop, so just that candy part without any of the lemon flavor. And that is, to me, I've tasted that in lagers, I've tasted that in pale ale, IPA, all styles. And to me, that is the cold side oxidation thing. I know a lot of people will say it takes on like a wet cardboard. I've never eaten wet cardboard, so I don't know what that tastes like. And then the third one is that particularly in hoppier beers, that hop character tends to fall off. If I'm not getting all 3 of those, I start to look at other things. Maybe it's not oxidation. And based on the way it sounds like you're doing this, Huell, that I don't know if that would be cold side oxidation unless you're not purging that keg first. It sounds like you are. I know you're not pushing CO2 out or a sanitizer out with CO2, but based on what I'm reading, it sounds like you're doing a solid job of eliminating as much oxidation or oxygen as possible. So I wonder if it's not just a case of hop character falling out. I mean, that is something that IPA brewers have been chasing and trying to figure out how to fight for forever, since IPA has been a thing. And that may very well be it. I don't know. But the way that I'm reading what you're writing, you're doing all the right stuff. And so it doesn't seem like it would be cold side oxidation. Now, go back and have one of those beers after 3 or 4 weeks. And if you notice that it has kind of that sickly sweet character, then yeah, you're probably getting some form of oxidation. And that could be the culprit for your reduced hop character. Would canning instead of kegging a freshly made New England IPA help the flavor retention? I actually don't think so. I think cans are far more difficult to purge of oxygen given how big their openings are than a keg, which you're purging while it's closed. So I don't think that would be the solution. Fermenters... Your fermenters do allow for pressure transfers, I promise. If you have an airlock hole, you can attach CO2 at less than 1 psi just to displace the oxygen or the air that is in that fermentation vessel while the beer is running out of it into the keg. So that's, yes, you're not pushing it with gas, so to speak, but you can still displace that air that is in there so that oxygen isn't coming in contact with at least with the surface of that beer. So don't think that I've done this with PET carboys. I've tried it with a glass carboy. I've never had issues with it. So that is an option as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well too. I don't know that upgrading your equipment is going to make it better, unless, like I said, unless you're having leaks or something's wrong or broken on your equipment, and it's just not something that you can fix easily. Right. But I really don't think that's going to be the case. There were 2 other things that I would say too that might help you, but I don't think these are well, maybe they might help. One of them is you could check your CO2 supplier. Sometimes, CO2 is supposed to be, depending on where you're getting your CO2, it's supposed to be like very, pure CO2 or like 99.7 or something like that. It's some high number like that. But sometimes that CO2 supply can have, as much as like 3 or 4% oxygen in there. And if it's got that in there, that may be causing an issue. Yeah. That happened at a brewery a while back, one of the big breweries a while back, and they had to fire their CO2 supplier. But that again, that's probably not the case here because most CO2 suppliers are conscious of what they're using. Yeah. The other thing is, and this is sort of different than a lot of the Brülosophy experiments, is hot side oxidation. There's some talk about that. If you're splashing your wort and getting hot oxygen in there, there are some reactions that can happen in the boil that might lead to things later. Again, those 2 things I think probably aren't having the issue or causing it, but they're also things to look at. There's so much to think about whenever we're trying to brew great beer. Yeah. But let's go to the next question. So Dave Frankowski asks, what specific products would you recommend for conducting a closed transfer with CO2 from an SS brew bucket to a keg? And what about other types of fermenters?
Good question. There's a very specific answer that I will give you. I'll start with your second question. What about other types of fermenters? I've been using the Delta Brewing Systems firm tanks lately. And to date, it's probably my favorite fermenter, not only because it's one of the least expensive stainless options out there, but it has some really simple additions that other fermentation vessels don't have that I just find really convenient. One of them is a bottom clean out port. I was talking with the folks from Delta Systems and they were like, please don't sell this as a yeast dump. It's not a yeast dump, but some of us are dumb enough to use it for a yeast dump. And I love that. You can rid the beer of dry hop additions. You can, if you make fruit additions, you can just open this port and dump this stuff out. So I love that, but it also allows for pressurized fermentation up to, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I think it's like 5 PSI. And so you can like we were talking about with the last person with Huel there, you can actually push the beer out of the fermentation vessel into a keg. And so and that's what I do for every batch that I brew nowadays. And so whether it's a SS brew bucket or a Delta firm tank, it's the same thing. SS brew buckets will hold I believe 1 PSI. And so you can absolutely do pressure transfers with it. Don't go over 1 PSI. What you need is a CO2 tank. So you need to get your CO2 cylinder. You need to fill that with CO2. You got to have a regulator to attach to that tank. And there are regulators all over. More Beer has some great regulators. I forget what the brand name is. I think it's Katam or something, but I just bought one for like $30. That works beautifully. You're going to need some tubing, some gas tubing to connect to that regulator, and then a disconnect, whatever type of disconnect that you use for your kegs. So if your kegs are ball lock, get a ball lock gas disconnect. If you're using pin lock, get a pin lock gas disconnect. And then that's it. And then you're going to need some tubing to connect to your fermentation vessel, your brew bucket or your firm tank, with another liquid disconnect that you put on your keg. And then you just turn your pressure on really low and let it flow out. And that's it. That's a pressurized transfer. Works beautifully for me.
Yeah, and I can talk specifically about, the modifications to the brew bucket because that's what I had, and that's what I still ferment in is the brew bucket. And so I see now that brew bucket or the SS BrewTech sells a domed lid, and so you can, if you are using the brew buckets, you can purchase that domed lid separately, and that domed lid will have like a valve or an opening, a port at the top that you can attach a pressurizing lid to, and they have an online video about how to do that, and you can find that product specifically for them. But what I did was I did this before they had the dome lid, is actually cut a hole in the top of the bucket and then add a 1.5 inch tri-clamp port to the top, and then they have this little pressurized transfer thing that's got a little poppet on it that you can pull up or will pop open if the brew bucket gets too pressurized. Using the flat lid though, and this has been difficult for me recently, is it really, like Marshall said, it really can only take like less than 1, 2, or 3 PSI. Yeah. If I get more than that seal on the brew bucket breaks, and I mean like literally breaks, and then gas just leaks out.
Yep.
That's not. Like I said, I think SS BrewTech is doing something about it with the domed lid, but that's what I did. And so if you Google pressurized transfer brew bucket, you'll find instructions from SS BrewTech about how to modify the flat lid.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are the specific things about the SS brew bucket. There's, you need the tri-clamp port, but there's a list. There's a list. If you, like I said, pressurized transfer brew bucket, and then that will get there. The other thing was, and this sounds like a great idea, is the way that Huel was doing it. Our last listener doing the closed loop transfer, where you've got you got your fermenter sitting up higher than your keg, and then you're just attaching the gas line from the keg up to the fermenter, and then using a closed loop transfer. As long as you've got gravity or a pump that's pulling the wort out of the fermenter into the keg, you've created a closed loop transfer there.
Yeah.
So and that should also help with cold side oxidation.
Yeah, I've actually never tried the closed loop transfer thing. I've received numerous emails from people asking why I haven't, but it's just nothing that I've ever, I don't know, I've never considered doing it. One final point on that, because I did modify my SS brew buckets specifically for pressure transfers, not pressure fermentation. A pressure transfer, again, you can put, as long as you've got that bottom valve opened and beer is running out, that pressure is going to push that beer out. It's not going to break your fermentation vessel as long as it's low enough PSI. I just picked up a weldless disconnect, a gas post that you can buy and just attached to it works perfectly fine. You can attach it to the airlock hole in the top of your fermentation bucket or your SS BrewTech brew bucket. And then, what are you going to do during fermentation? You just make a blow off tube with an extra gas disconnect and some tubing. That's all I do. And it works perfectly fine. And then when I go to keg that beer, all I do is I attach a gas disconnect from my tank, and my regulator to that post and pump 1 PSI of gas in while I'm kegging my beer. It's totally closed and it works really well. So that's another option as well. All right. Next question comes from Charles Simon from Portland, Oregon, who says, I have a question related to no-chill methods. I normally brew 10-gallon batches and was wondering what your thoughts are on transferring 180-degree-ish wort, that's around 82C, I believe, over to my stainless conical fermenter that sits inside a temp-controlled fermentation chamber. Do you have any guesses as to the amount of time it would take to get the 10 gallons of wort down to pitching temperature? And are there any other challenges I am not considering in this scenario?
These kinds of questions really scare me because not because I think he's doing anything wrong or anything, but it's been so drilled into me to crash as low as you can, to crash down to pitching temp and then pitch your yeast immediately. And I think I've recently started to understand, this is sort of Cade's theory. I've recently started to understand why that is. Brewer's yeast grows really rapidly. Okay, so if you can put it in the wort, get it down to the temperature where the yeast can do its thing, it'll start to produce alcohol so quickly that it pretty much overwhelms anything other that could spoil your batch, right? And it creates this sort of sanitizing effect, not sanitizing, but it creates harsh conditions for anything else to grow, or to survive. Now, that's not to say that lacto and Brettanomyces can't survive in there, because they can. But it's this really nice insurance on getting your beer fermenting as quick as possible. And there's the other thing about doing it as fast as you can, right? Getting the beer produced and out into a package so that you can drink it as quickly as possible. Now, all that said, your question's ultimately, can I just dump hot wort into my fermenter and let it go. And I have done this in the past, right? I have done this because there've been occasions where my immersion chiller's broken or I couldn't find a water hose or whatever. So I have done this. I've never done it with 10 gallons, but with 5 gallons, dumping boiling wort into the fermenter, it takes about 24 hours to cool. And I know a bunch of the people over in Australia are doing, the cube method, the no-chill cube method, where they're just putting it in the cube and letting it chill there. But so with 10 gallons of wort, I would think it's going to take quite a while. I'd guess something like 36 hours. But again, I don't have actual experience with that. It also depends on where you're storing it. If you're just putting it at room temperature or, in a room temperature fermentation chamber, it's going to cool slower. Yeah. If you've got it in a freezer or something that's going to be down colder, then it'll chill faster. So, it just kind of depends on what you're using to chill it. If it's sitting in an ice bath, obviously it's going to cool faster. And the last thing I would say is, ultimately, this is a question of how well you trust your cleaning and sanitation practices. Because if you do have something in your fermenter, there's a real issue with you leaving your beer to chill for 24 to 36 hours that something else could take hold.
Well, I think a part of what Charles is asking and why he chills it to 180 degrees or 82C is because that's still above pasteurization temp, if I'm not mistaken. And so I understand the concept, right? Can I just rack this over to my stainless fermentation vessel that has been sanitized, which I but then also trusting that this wort is still hot enough to kind of take care of any of the beer spoilage bacteria or microbes on its own, and then just leave it overnight or whatever. I don't know how long it would take to chill it. I would imagine, I'm with you, Cade. I think I'd probably take 2 days or so if it's 180 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe less. And also, it depends on how cold your chamber is. But the arguments that I've heard about with doing this, I personally don't think you're going to have much of an issue. There's this argument that like botulism can grow and you could end up dying and blah, blah, blah. I don't know anybody who's died of botulism. Maybe it's because they're already dead. I don't know. But if you want to, I know people who've tried this and they're still alive and I don't know how the beer turned out. More power to all the people who do no chill brewing. The beers that I've had that have been no chilled, and I've brewed a couple myself, I've gotten a unique characteristic off of those that I don't get out of quick chilled beers, if you will. And so it's just not my thing. But if you are just not wanting to chill your wort, and rack it over to a stainless fermentation vessel, I believe most manufacturers of these vessels will tell you not to do that. I think they're just doing that to cover their ass type of thing. It also depends on what types of, O-rings and whatnot that your stainless vessel has on it. So you just got to be mindful of all of that. But chances are you're going to get away with it and end up making a beer. Who knows how good it'll taste? But I guess to say that I understand the impetus for this question, wanting to shave some time off of your brew day and just get that wort into the fermentation vessel as quickly as possible. I just don't know if it's if it's going to cause any problems or not. So
yeah, the last thing I would say on that too is that he says Charles says he's fermenting in a stainless steel conical fermenter. Don't do this in glass. Do not put boiling hot wort in glass that's at room temperature.
Or PET.
You just don't want to risk PET. Yeah. Right? Just because I just wanted to say that. And then also the other thing too is remember that there's going to be a negative pressure created in the fermentation vessel as it cools.
Yep.
So if you've got that fermenter sealed off, you may cavitate the fermenter. So just walk by and open it, pop it open a couple and let that pressure out.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Well, we've got to take a quick break. When we're back, more Brü A questions. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. All right, Cade, time to get to another set of listener-submitted questions. Why don't you kick us off on this one?
All right, let's start over in Australia. So we had Campbell Starkey from, I think it's Canberra? I'm not sure how to say it, but Canberra, Australia. He says, I'm fairly new to the hobby with about 10 brews under my belt over the last 6 months. I currently do brew in a bag in a 20-liter pot on my kitchen stove, doing half batches or even less for giant grain bills. I'm looking at some gear upgrades and wondering what you would prioritize out of the following. A kegerator, I don't like bottling. Me either. A grain mill, I currently buy crushed grain from my local shop. An all-in-one system like a Bruzilla, bigger batches, better control, and I wouldn't have to kick my housemate out of our kitchen on brew day, or flasks, stir plates, or etc. to make reusing yeast easier. It's hard to know what will make the biggest difference to my brew day and beer for my dollar. Any words of wisdom?
Oh my word. This is such a subjective question, and to be honest, I really think that my answer, if I'd have answered this 10 years ago, it would have been different than my answer 5 years ago, which is likely going to be different than how I'm going to respond today. If you're making good beer, and I understand that you're bottling right now, Campbell, if you're making good beer and you're happy with it, then I probably wouldn't move to upgrading to something like a Bruzilla just yet. And I would probably go to maybe make a kegerator first, because that to me was the one main thing that I did that kept me from stopping brewing. I hated bottling with everything in me. It took too long. It was messy. It required too much gear. Kegging is so easy, and you get to drink that beer right away. You don't have to wait for it to carbonate if you do burst carbonation. So that's probably the direction that I'm going to go on this one. Milling your own grain is awesome, but you do have a local shop that does it for you, so you don't need to do that just yet. All-in-one systems, it's what most of us are using nowadays. They're amazing, but if you're already making tasty beer, then keep on doing what you're doing. The whole reusing yeast and all that, you can do that with a water bottle if you need to, or a growler. Stir plates, I'm not sure how necessary they are for propping up yeast. So, yep, I'm gonna have to go with kegerator as my final answer.
Yeah, it's funny because you said this was subjective, and that was exactly what my answer was going to be. It depends on you as a brewer. Actually, this is a good time for me to tell everybody my favorite lawyer joke. Or I'll ask you, Michael or Marshall, how many lawyers does it take to change a light bulb?
Oh boy.
It depends. Define light bulb, which is good. If you know any lawyers, they'll find that hilarious. But it depends on you as a brewer. So my words of wisdom are maximize your enjoyment. Okay, and so I would start by asking just two questions. It's what do you find most difficult, or stated differently, what do you hate the most about your current brewing process? And then the other one is what do you find the most fun? Okay, so if you like the idea of making yeast starters, you find it fun, you want to have a stir plate and flasks and jars, you want to start harvesting yeast, you don't want to keep buying, packets of yeast from the homebrew store, and that sounds fun to you, then maybe that's the best thing for you to do next, is just start making yeast starters and harvesting. A lot of people find that really fun, and I think that's, that's meaningful. I hated bottling like Marshall. It was a pain in the butt cleaning 40 to 50 bottles every time, cleaning them, sanitizing them, racking, capping, wiping them all off, and then letting it ferment for another 2 weeks or so. And so that was one of those things that I wanted to stop doing as soon as possible. So I got a kegerator fairly early on into my brewing career. So that one is a good one, and I love Marshall's answer on that one. You said you've got a 20-liter pot brewing on your kitchen stove. It might be a good idea to get a propane gas burner and a bigger kettle or something, so you can go outside and start doing, your giant grain bills without half batches, and not kicking your buddy out of the kitchen. It really, really does depend on you. The thing that I did first was, like Marshall, the kegging system, because that was what was most important to me. And hell, if you want to go for an all-in-one system, if you just want to have bigger batches, better control, and like you said, and not have to worry about it, then just go with the all-in-one system. It's kind of up to you. So my answer is really, really wishy-washy and squirrely, and that is it depends.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the question. I will say it's also a matter of economy. I mean, how much money do you have? For me, I mean, and I'm not trying to brag or anything, but buying a flask and a stir plate was far easier financially speaking than getting into a whole entire kegging system. The very first kegerator I ever made was out of a refrigerator that I found on Craigslist, and with all of the parts, I was still at $600-$700 in the end. I got a stir plate and a flask for like $80, you know. So I mean, if you're gonna do that anyways, but I mean, if you've got the cash to drop on a kegerator, that's probably the direction I'm gonna go. Same thing with the all-in-one system. I mean, you're looking at I think the lowest end here in the United States, at least, you're looking at something like, I don't know, $400 or $500 all the way up to $2,000, depending on how deep you want to get into it. So think about your finances and think about what it is that I like what you said, Cade. What's the most important aspect to it? What's going to keep you interested? Also, what's going to keep you brewing? Because that's what it was for me with Kegerator. So next question comes from Robert Grabowski from Cleveland, Ohio. He says, I'm still pretty new to brewing, but I have a handful of brews under my belt now and have been looking for ways to refine my technique to be more time and cost efficient. Your podcast has been extremely helpful for this. Well, thank you, Robert. I've been using a few of your suggestions for harvesting and storing yeast for later batches, and it's been going well. My question is, if I'm using a commercially prepared lactobacillus blend, A, is there any benefit to using a starter to prop it up? And B, can I use similar vitality starter techniques to store a portion of the starter for later propagation and use it in future batches? If so, how long could a lacto culture be stored? I'm not sure if this is a possibility given the dogma regarding lactose sensitivity to oxygen.
Oh, yeah. So this is a really tough one, and it's not something that I have a lot of familiarity with. I'm going to sort of fumble around for a little bit, but this is subject to being corrected later. One thing I will start off the very first is saying, Milk the Funk has a whole section on starters for lactobacillus. So if you go to Milk the Funk and read what they put there, that's a really, really great place to start to learn if they're to learn these things. Is there a benefit to a starter? Honestly, I think yes. And here's what I'll say. It just depends on, bacteria shares the same growth phases as yeast, right? There's a lag phase where they're sort of prepping everything, getting ready to grow, and then they grow exponentially. They grow super fast. And then once they've sort of reached a critical mass, I'm going to use that word in air quotes, but once they've reached a critical mass where there's, a whole bunch of cells around and not a lot of nutrients and stuff like that, they go into stationary phase where they just kind of sit and hang out for a little bit. And then they go into death and decay once all the nutrients run out. Okay, so as soon as the cells go into the package, they're at that stationary phase, okay, which means they only have one place left to go, and that's death and decay. The question is, how long does it take to get there? And that's going to vary a lot depending on commercial suppliers. So, if you've got a commercially prepared lactobacillus blend that's been sitting there for 6 months, then yeah, I would think it would be a good idea to use a starter, to prop up that bacteria so that you can get faster souring. The bacteria is healthy, it's ready to go, and you don't have any other sort of crazy issues. So that's kind of my fumbled around answer. In terms of the O2 thing, the sensitivity to oxygen, again, go through and read Milk the Funk. So where I'm pulling my information from is what I've learned from my microbiology class and from Milk the Funk. Lactobacillus is tolerant of oxygen, okay? Oxygen is not toxic to lactobacillus, right. Okay? And so I think where this thing came from was, there was a while where manufacturers were saying, don't aerate lactobacillus, don't aerate it, don't add oxygen to aeration. And everybody went, oh crap, that must be because oxygen is bad. No, it doesn't need oxygen to do anything. Right. Right? Yeah. So it's just like, no aeration doesn't mean oxygen is toxic. It just means you don't need to aerate lacto.
Yeah. Okay. So there's nothing further that I'm able to add that you didn't already say. I am an idiot when it comes to most of the mixed fermentation, sour beer brewing stuff. I can tell you some anecdote that I've heard. I can tell you things other people who are far smarter than me have mentioned that I recall them saying. One is that and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Cade. I love being wrong about stuff. Ask my wife. What I've heard is that with lactobacillus, it doesn't necessarily require a starter so long as the lactose not too old or too damaged, maybe by heat or whatever. And in fact, that by, I guess, what we would refer with yeast to as something like underpitching, that you can actually get more characterful souring out of it, because again, with yeast, what we refer to as stress, actually forces it to push out more lactic acid. I don't know how true that is. I've never messed around with lactobacillus cultures or anything like that, so I just cannot speak to this. My strong recommendation, what I have in my notes, is you got to check out Milk the Funk. They will answer all of your questions on this far better than I ever could.
Yeah, exactly. And then you asked that one other question about harvesting. Can you harvest lacto? And I would say, I think that the answer to that is yes, just for the same reasons that I just talked about, that you can grow up bacteria cells.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think that's what the manufacturer's doing anyway, right?
They have
cells.
to, right? I mean, that's exactly what they're doing. It's not like they're inventing new lactobacillus. So
yeah, exactly. But like Marshall said, milk the funk, milk the funk, milk the funk. That is the best resource out there for any questions you have about lactobacillus.
Absolutely.
All right, next question's from Alex Brown. I've always been super confused about stepping up a starter versus using a larger volume. I just recently caught up on episode 82 about decanting yeast starters, and you guys talked a lot about creating really big volume starters when fermenting lagers, which really got me thinking about how I typically do starters. Is stepping up only necessary if you don't have a large enough vessel for a bigger one-step starter? Or does yeast theoretically react differently to the two different methods? I've tried modeling this out using various calculators, but it just confuses me more. Any guidance on the key differences between stepping up versus larger volume would be incredibly helpful so I can finally wrap my head around it.
First off, why are we getting so many questions about yeast starters lately?
Right?
It's nuts. But yeah, the whole stepping up thing. I mean, I started making starters probably 10 years ago or so. And, when I got into it, I bought a 2-liter Erlenmeyer flask, and that's what you used. It was large enough for the majority of starters that I would make for the ale that I was brewing. And yeah, stepping up was a big thing when it came to needing higher pitch rates. And so in order to do that, you have to have more sugar for those yeast to metabolize and reproduce with. And so a big thing, yeah, with lagers, you're going to, if you don't have a large enough flask or a large enough vessel, at least, then yeah, stepping up is going to allow you to, propagate enough yeast, theoretically, to pitch into a cold fermented lager, so that you get the intended outcome, what you're hoping to get out of that. Same thing goes for if you're brewing a very high OG beer. That was probably actually the first time I ever considered stepping something up. Was I was brewing a Russian Imperial Stout many years ago, and I did not want to underpitch it. I'd had bad experiences with underpitching really high OG beers, and so you step up from what you've got. You make 2 or 3 starters, and it's a really easy way to get that pitch rate that you need. There are. Do you need to do it? I don't know. The whole numbers part of it, again, that's not something I've necessarily concerned myself with. I was more of look at that big slug of yeast that I got. That seems like it'll be good enough for me. So modeling it out on the calculators, we've all done that. I guarantee we've all messed around with doing that. Another place where stepping up starters is incredibly helpful, if not completely necessary, is if you want to, say, harvest yeast from a commercial bottle of something. I tried this once with a port brewing beer, and came to find out that they actually carbonate in the bottle with a wine yeast that does not make tasty beer. So, but it's good for bottle carbonation. But yeah, you can do that as well. So if you see a slug of yeast, say, at the bottom of a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale bottle, and you want to propagate that for use, then stepping up is the way to do it without stressing that yeast. So you don't want to pitch just that tiny amount, of yeast dregs into a, 2-liter starter. You're going to stress that yeast. So you step it up in a smaller starter and kind of build it from there.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head there for me, Marshall, and Alex may know this, and we probably should have said this earlier, but it bears repeating that starters are just about the number of yeast cells that you want to pitch into the beer.
Yep.
And or if you want to harvest cells for later use. But it's just about getting the right number of cells in the beer so that the yeast can do its thing and produce the beer that you want, right? So if you don't have a way to do cell counts, right? If you don't have a microscope and a way to count cells, then you're just kind of estimating. And like Marshall said, it all just comes down to, do I have a big enough slug of yeast that looks right? Or what does the calculator tell me should be in here? Now, stepping up, one of the things about stepping up versus using just a bigger starter, the easiest thing is just, if you're using a bigger volume, you just have to do it once, right? You don't have to make 2 batches in order to step something up. But if you're stepping up, like for example, if I need 300 or 400 billion cells, but my equipment only allows me to do 200 billion cells, then I'm going to have to make 2 starters, right? And that's going to require stepping up. And if you're stepping up, you are making a new generation of cells again. So that does mean you're making another generation. You need to count that in your generation count. For those of us that care about those sorts of things. But those are just a couple of things that I would think about for stepping up and using a bigger starter. If you've got the ability to use a bigger starter, the reason why we talked about doing that is just because it's easier. It's just easier to make a big volume if you've got the equipment and you're able to do it.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the only time that I view at least stepping up a starter as being more necessary, as being at the very least safer, reducing the risk of off flavors while increasing the chances that you're going to produce a good slug of yeast to pitch into a future beer, is when you're starting with a very, very low cell count as it is. So if you're harvesting yeast from, say, a bottle drag or something like that, then yes, stepping up, you don't want to pitch that tiny little amount of yeast into a big old starter because it could potentially stress that yeast to the point that it ends up producing flavors that you do not want in your beer. So, all right, next question actually is 2 questions that comes from Chris Branuelas about naturally purging during keg or during fermentation in the keg. Naturally purging a keg during fermentation. The first question, he says, I ferment 10-gallon or 38-liter batches in a spike conical fermenter and recently tried your method of using CO2 from fermentation to purge the sanitizer out of a keg. I wasn't able to make it work because I couldn't keep a good seal on the keg lid at the very low pressures generated. I tried a new O-ring and even some keg lube, but no luck. It was a well-used corny keg, and it does set and hold pressure under normal conditions. He says 10 plus PSI. I'll try again in the future with a newer keg, but I'd like to know if others have dealt with this problem. Cade, have you ever done this where you take the CO2 produced during fermentation and you use that to purge a keg?
No, I haven't. The only time I do a method that's like this is whenever I'm just close transferring, right? But never actually done and used used the CO2 of fermentation to purge the keg.
So I have. I've done it quite a bit. I haven't been doing it as much lately because I've realized that setting it up, I always forget to set it up, I'll be honest with you. And so fermentation is going and I'm like, crap. But I do it when I remember, and I've had this same exact issue. The first thing I'm going to recommend, Chris, is I keep a spray bottle of sanitizer solution around all the time just to spray things down when I need them kind of on the spot. It's bubbly. I mean, Star San will bubble up, and so it's got a surfactant in it that will allow it to bubble like soap. One thing you can do is connect everything properly, and then take that spray bottle and spray the top of your closed off keg just to see where the leak is at. And that will at least give you somewhere to focus on to try to fix this issue. Your kegs ideally your kegs should not be leaking if you close them properly and everything is tightened down properly. One area where things can leak from is the O-ring that is on the gas out post, or either of the posts really, depending on where the gas is coming out of when you're doing this type of a setup. You got to replace those, make sure they're well lubed. When I lube everything up properly and make sure it's all sealed, I don't have this issue. One thing that you can do to deal with this problem is put like 5 PSI on the keg in the beginning just to kind of start it, and then let your fermentation vessel, once fermentation is going, it will be producing enough CO2 at that point to where you can put your disconnect on the keg to release the pressure, but then immediately do the disconnect from the fermentation vessel to the keg, and it should be enough to not unseat those seals. So that's my response for that. I mean, if you have another keg, maybe try that one first and see if that one holds pressure. But this should not be something that's happening regularly. All of my kegs, and I've got used and new ones, they all hold pressure without having me to put gas on the keg first. So next question, aside from this, I've noticed that when using a blow-off tube submerged in a bottle of fresh sanitizer, by the end of fermentation, the liquid sanitizer has a yellowish, sometimes even slightly cloudy look. I know for certain that I'm not getting any kreuzen in the tube, and there's plenty of headspace between the beer and the conical lid. I'm assuming that something, wort, yeast oils, or is volatilizing off the fermenting beer and being captured in the sanitizer. So I'm wondering if it's good practice to use CO2 from fermentation to purge a keg to receive the beer. It's a closed system, so contamination isn't much of a concern. Like many of your experiments, I imagine it wouldn't result in an identifiable difference, but it's an interesting question of whether possible off flavors from fermenting wort might be tagging along with the CO2.
Yeah, so I'm going to make an assumption here, Chris. I think you're using Star San as your sanitizer. If you're saying that it looks yellowish or cloudy, if you're using iodophor or an iodine based, it will be yellowish or orange before it starts. So I think you're using Star San, and if you are using Star San changes color and becomes cloudy when the pH changes. Right. So it's an acid sanitizer, which means when the pH rises in Star San, which it will do by just sort of sitting naturally in water, it starts to become cloudy and milky. And if you have hard water, like I did in Austin, in Texas, it will become cloudy within minutes just from contact with water. So that's, I think, what is causing the issue. Yes, if you're blowing off stuff into the sanitizer, of course, that's going to cause something to change color, right? And I think you're not talking about that scenario. You're saying nothing is blowing off into the sanitizer. It's just changing color. That, to me, is the most likely culprit. Star San is fairly well known for doing that. If you're worried, by the way, there's that changing color does mean that the Star San is going out of its pH range and so may not be as effective. But again, you're not using it as sanitizer. You're just using it so that no microbes can get into your fermenter. The CO2 is blowing off and blowing into the water and then going through the water and diffusing out of the water into the air. Yeah. You can just use water instead of sanitizer. Most people just use sanitizer because that way stuff doesn't grow on the water or something, and you don't have that issue. I'd say just use a different sanitizer, or honestly, don't worry about it.
Yeah, Star San is marginally safer than water. I mean, if you're sanitizing your keg really well, you could ostensibly get away with just filling it with water and pushing that out for your CO2 purging purposes. I got to be honest, I've not experienced what you're talking about here, Chris, with the color change or the cloudiness coming from putting the CO2 blow off tube, into the sanitizer. I keep a full bucket of sanitizer right next to my fermentation area. So I just run the blow off tube directly into that bucket and it stays crystal clear. It doesn't turn color. So I have no idea what would be causing that. The one thought that I had was that I don't brew nearly as many hoppy beers as I do, low hop lager style beers. And I know a lot of people are focused primarily on hoppy beers. Maybe, I don't know how this would work, but maybe something about all of the hop compounds and stuff that get trapped in that cloud of CO2 above the fermenting beer. Some of that's getting blown off and impacting the way your Star San looks. But that just doesn't make any sense to me that would be the case. So I really can't speak to what's going on. I'm with you. You would know easily if you were blowing off stuff and that was going into your Star San, your blow off Star San, because you'd see it in the tubing. You'd see kreuzen drying up in the tubing. So I don't think that's it either. I just can't speak to this one because it's never happened to me. It is a method that I absolutely love and that I've not had any issues with. Now, one thing that I have noticed, just for fun, I have an experiment plan to test this out, but one of the things people asked me after I published the article on how I do this, using naturally produced CO2 to purge the keg that the beer will eventually go into. People were saying, well, how often do you reuse that sanitizer once it gets pushed to the second keg? Well, I did it like 4 or 5 times once, and I'd never opened the keg. So once that Star San went into the second keg, it stayed closed until I purged that keg and racked more beer in there. I mean, basically it stayed closed until I cleaned that empty keg out. By I believe it was a 4th batch, I finally opened up the keg that had that Star San, I call it the purging Star San, right? The purging sanitizer. Did it smell different? Absolutely. It smelled like beer. I mean, it smelled like fermenting, hoppy, yeasty kind of, it had the essence of that. I mean, it was obviously still relatively clean. I poured it out. I poured some out into a glass just to look at it, and it wasn't hazy. It was clear. It looked good. It just had naturally, I mean, this makes sense to me. Those kegs are never open, so it kind of held on to some of those aromas, but I don't think it negatively impacted the beer. I mean, I can tell you anecdotally, it didn't have a negative impact on the beers that I was kegging into those, that I was racking into those kegs that had been naturally purged. So yes, I think that's a great opportunity for an experiment, because I could see potentially that air or whatever, once that Star San is purged out, maybe have mixing with the beer and having some sort of an impact on flavor and aroma. But
yeah, that's always one of those questions too, right? Like, it makes sense why we did all those experiments about like, what are you losing from hop volatiles, right? Like if I can smell it in the air, that means it's not in my beer, right? And it does, I always do wonder, like, is it just that our sensitivity is so low that we can smell those compounds, even though they're like very, very low concentration?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I have had with sanitizer, I've had a lot of experience with it because it does it so often in Austin. Is that Star San turns yellowish and cloudy. It looks like soap or like and like milky. And even if you touch it, it starts to get like sticky on your fingers. Not sticky, but maybe like viscous on your fingers. And that's just the pH. That pH causes those surfactants to come out of solution. So if that's what it is, it could just be the water that's sitting there. But again, I wouldn't worry too much about that color change. I don't think, like you said, Marshall, that it has anything to do with the CO2, coming out, even though maybe that CO2 is picking up some aroma, maybe the sanitizer is picking up some aroma from the CO2 that's blowing off of the fermenter. But yeah, I don't know. I just wouldn't worry too much about it, I think.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. And that is all she wrote for episode 200. First off, we really appreciate all of you for submitting those questions. They're always fun to answer, and I cannot say enough. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to us babble on about this thing that we love so much for 200 episodes. And an extra special cheers to those who support us on Patreon. There's absolutely no way we'd be here without you. If there's anything at all you'd like for us to address in a future Brü A episode, that will be 10 episodes from now, please send your questions to feedback@brülosophy.com and make sure to indicate that it's for Brü A in the subject line so we can add it to the list. As much as we love responding to your brewing questions, we are cool answering whatever other questions you might have for us as well, within reason, at least. Well, don't forget to subscribe to our other podcast, The Brew Lab, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing scientists, and make sure to head to brülosophy.com to read up on all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we're up to. The Brülosophy Podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.